In 1971, the world was becoming a darker place, and in response, the cinema presented Harry Callahan, better known as Dirty Harry.
You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
That same year, Sean Connery said goodbye to James Bond in Diamonds Are Forever.
Sean Connery, alias James Bond 007, is back in action.
And Woody Allen took a strange vacation in Bananas. But the big premiere of the year would be an iconic work, transgressive for its images, as well as representing what we are capable of as humans. Directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Malcolm McDowell. This is the story of A Clockwork Orange. The story of the film began some time ago with the novel of the same name written by Anthony Burgess, writer, World War II veteran, and composer. Burgess was born on February 25, 1917 in Manchester, from a family linked to music. From an early age, he would feel attracted to the arts. Graduated in English literature at Manchester University. After serving in the army, he would settle with his wife in Malaysia, then a British colony, as a literature teacher. At the end of the 50s, his life changed completely when he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, not knowing how much time he had left to live. This fact would make him abandon teaching to return to his homeland, dedicating himself 100% as a writer. But to his surprise, the England he left decades ago was no longer the same as before. At that time, youth culture was increasingly boiling. Groups like the Teddy Boys and later the Mods, Rockers, and Rude Boys represented a non-conforming generation, seeing themselves represented in the groups they listened to and the way they dressed. This occurred in a context of unemployment that was reflected in violence and insecurity. One event in particular when a group of young men assaulted Burgess's wife. These factors would cause this to begin to develop a dystopian story where young people are unrestrained in the face of a totalitarian authority and violence as an element of re-education. The writer would declare in interviews that he was inspired by dystopian works such as Orwell's classic 1984, as well as Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Finally, in 1962, Anthony Burgess published A Clockwork Orange, a title that refers to a local expression from Manchester. The book introduces us to Alex and his group of gang friends, the Drugos, addicted to stimuli such as women, drugs, but above all, ultraviolence. Alex will be a test subject for an experiment whereby raising the violence to the maximum correct him to be a useful citizen. The novel would have a good reception, calling it deep violence. Other media would criticize it as an apology for crime. When it arrived in the United States, curiously, the ending of the book would be modified. Originally, Burgess's version had a final chapter where Alex, after repeating his violent behavior, redeems himself definitively in a moral outcome. But North American publishers would say that this ending would not please their readers, opting for a more realistic and dark one where Alex accepts his wild nature. In addition to minimal modifications to the book's own NADSAT language, the language used by Alex and his group. A Clockwork Orange would not be a bestseller, but it would achieve recognition in art circles. By the mid-60s, Andy Warhol himself would declare that he was delighted with the book, going so far as to make a short film like Vinyl in 1965, made at the famous The Factory. Other interested parties would be none other than the Rolling Stones with Mick Jagger playing Alex. The film was to be directed by the young filmmaker Ken Russell, later known for Tommy and Altered States. But production would be prevented by the entity that rates films in England, which, if made, would censor a large part of the book's scenes. Anthony Burgess sold the adaptation rights to Warner for just $500, while at the same time a copy of the book reached director Stanley Kubrick through his wife Christiane. The director came from successful literary adaptations such as Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, and 2001, A Space Odyssey. By the end of the 60s, he was pre-producing one of his great obsessions, such as making a film about Napoleon. Project that could never be realized. This is how the possibility of adapting A Clockwork Orange arose, because the director had a close relationship with the Warner studio. By then, films whose stories involve gangs and authority figures had an interesting tradition. Works like Angels with Dirty Faces with James Cagney, the musical West Side Story, and Closer in Time, Roger Corman's films like Wild Angels. Movies that represented youthful dissatisfaction, but most of them had a moral outcome. Nobody expected what Kubrick had in his hands. This was faced with the challenge of carrying out with a limited budget. If in 2001 there had been an investment greater than $10 million, A Clockwork Orange would have only $2.2 million. Kubrick would surround himself with the technical team he had been working with, such as John Alcott, the renowned director of photography, but he would also bet on new names. Case Bill Butler as editor, and newcomer Milena Canonero in an important role in the film, such as costumes. Black boots, pants, and a white shirt with suspenders, as well a genital protector worn on the outside, clear allusion to sexual and violent power. We also find the iconic bowler hat and canes, elements that are related to the highest classes. With the behind-the-scenes done, it remained to find the cast. Kubrick would not doubt who Alex should be, Malcolm McDowell. The actor with the longest television career and incipient film career, standing out in If. He was the ideal person for the protagonist. A charismatic young man with an exemplary appearance but with a sadistic look, capable of saying it all. The rest of the cast was made up of performers such as Adrienne Corey, Patrick Maget, Warren Clark, and making a brief appearance, David Prowse, the bodybuilder in the future known for playing Darth Vader. Most of these actors had a greater television and theater presence, and unlike previous films where Kubrick had stars like Kirk Douglas, Peter Sellers, or James Mason, the director would choose not-so-well-known figures, in addition to a means of not exceeding the budget. Filming would take place in London, beginning in September 1970 and ending in April of the following year. In the first instance, Anthony Burgess participated as a scriptwriter, but after differences with the director, Kubrick himself would write it. The biggest difference was in the ending, since the director was more familiar with the North American version. Such would be his approach to the book, that on several occasions he did not use a script, but instead used it for the scenes. One of the challenges of the production was to represent a dystopia with a lower budget. Unlike his previous film, Kubrick, he could not afford huge sets. This is where the search for a real location comes in. Finding her on the outskirts of London, Brunel University, with its brutalist architecture, was the ideal location for the re-education center. In the south of the city, we find the alley where a man is raped and the surrounding houses. The only set that was built for the film is the famous Korova Milk Bar. Christian Kubrick would participate in the art department to represent a different but not very distant future, an appreciation that we see in several films from this period. The 1960s are known as the decade of the space race. Fashion, architecture, and music integrated familiar and at the same time novel elements. In the film, we see a decoration that applies to the era, but also different aspects such as hair dye and costumes. Stanley Kubrick is a director known for the demands of his films, no matter what shots are needed, and in some cases, taking his protagonists to the extreme. That would be the case of Malcolm McDowell. One of the most iconic scenes, such as Alex's experiment with images of ultra-violence, would take 30 takes and the assistance of a real doctor to moisten his eyes. Despite this, in an attempt to remove the clips, the actor would injure his cornea. The most demanding scene that the actor remembers is when his former colleagues, now police officers, find him and decide to torture him, spending almost 1 minute underwater. Still, one of the most iconic scenes, and today part of pop culture, would have complete freedom from McDowell. Kubrick was not pleased with the sequence where Alex and the Drugos break into the house and beat the couple. 2 days of filming had already passed without the final take. The director would tell Malcolm McDowell to just improvise. The rest is history.
I'm singing in the road, just singing in the road. What a
One of Kubrick's trademarks as an author is the symmetry of the shots, but here we would also see the opposite. Since he was also a cameraman, in scenes of violence, he was placed on his shoulder following the scene in order to transmit more action. The camera was a 35mm Arriflex, a recent design that achieved its purpose through its quality and ease of use. The relationship between order and chaos would not only be visual, it can also be seen in music. Also, a narrative element, since one of Alex's stimuli is Ludwig van Beethoven. On the soundtrack, we find other classical composers such as Rossini and Sir Edward Elgar, but also a particular electronic melody like the one at the beginning. This same one composed by Wendy Carlos, a prodigy composer who would later compose The Shining. Finally, on December 19, 1971, A Clockwork Orange premiered in New York, and the controversy would not take long to arrive. The film would obtain the X rating and was rejected in several theaters. The rating would not be for its violence, but for sexuality. Kubrick would edit 30 seconds to at least get the R rating, editing out the ending where two women meet naked. This second version would be released in February 1972 in the United States and England. The film would be a success, grossing $114 million globally. It should be noted that in several countries, most of which were affected by a dictatorship such as Spain, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, among several others, the film was harshly censored. Curiously, Spain would have a film with meeting points titled Murder in Blood from 1973. Set in a world where juvenile delinquency has become a strong threat and a series of murders are carried out, a hospital could have found an experimental cure to rid human beings of all violent acts. It is there where we meet Anna, a young nurse who works at the institute but who is also the murderer. Anna will be involved in a strange relationship with the leader of a gang. Directed by Eloy de la Iglesia, it has clear parallels with Kubrick's work, but also aspects of Giallo. If you want to know more about the cultural impact of The Clockwork Orange in Spain, there is the documentary The Forbidden Orange from 2021, available on various streaming platforms. Returning to the film in question, it had quickly become a milestone. In countries where censorship was exercised, it had become a banner of freedom and democracy, while in the countries where it had been released, a point of rebellion. Rebellion that would transcend fiction. Months after the premiere, cases of home invasions and gang rapes would increase. This happened to a young Dutch woman who was traveling and was attacked by a group of young people while they were singing in the Rain. The press would not take long to denounce the film as an apology. Kubrick would receive hundreds of death threat letters for him and his family. The director, together with Warner Brothers, made the decision to withdraw A Clockwork Orange from cinemas in Great Britain, re-releasing it almost 30 years later in 2000. The film received several nominations at the Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Adapted Screenplay, and Editing, but ended the night empty-handed. The big winner of that 1972 Oscar was The French Connection by William Friedkin. For years, Kubrick would be elusive when it came to talking about his film, focusing on what would be his next production, 1975's Barry Lyndon. While Malcolm McDowell stated that thanks to the role of Alex, his career grew enormously, but at the same time, he continues to be seen as the character and not as the actor. He continued in films such as Caligula, Star Trek Generations, Tank Girl, and provided his voice for several DC Comics animated series and films, in all these cases, playing the antagonist. 50 years after its premiere, A Clockwork Orange continues to be a transgressive work, causing fascination and rejection, becoming a piece of pop culture. Directed by one of the great exponents of cinema, whose genius and work team managed to leave their mark on each film and genre, demonstrating that even at the top, great filmmakers accept budget challenges, risky stories, and creating their signature as an author.
I'm singing in the rain, just singing in the rain.